whole town. We've lost everything we've ever known. And
The tornado has its extremely violent, incredible destruction, winds greater than 200 miles an hour. It's the top of the list.
That morning did not feel like an ending at first. A man named William wakes up in a field, a quarter-mile from his house, blood and dirt pressed into his skin. The world rearranged so completely that it took time to understand he was still alive. The thing he remembers was him at home watching TV. He remembers the power cutting out. He remembers the whole house shaking, stopping, then shaking again, louder, longer, the air itself feeling wrong, the pressure dropping so fast it made his body notice. Then it felt like the house exploded, and then nothing. That moment, the blank space between the panic, wondering what's going to happen, and waking up somewhere else, is where this story lives. Not in the math of wins, not in the labels, but in how quickly a town can be turned into a place where people stand in the open air and can't find anything familiar to point to. Not their street, not their neighbour's roofline, not even the old landmarks that used to make directions feel simple.
we've lost our whole town. We've lost everything we've ever known. And
the tornado ripped houses from their cement foundations, obliterated large appliances, and toppled giant oak trees. Damage so severe, the National Weather Service gave the storm its highest rating.
An EF5 tornado has its extremely violent, incredible destruction, winds greater than 200 miles an hour. It's the top of the list.
That morning did not feel like an ending at first. The warning siren sounded more than once, enough times that it worked its way into routine, into that uneasy rhythm people learn in spring when the sky threatens and then backs off. The region had reason to be afraid. The National Weather Service would later describe the late April setup as an environment stacked for violent storms, with rich, low-level moisture and strong instability and wind shear coming together in a way that forecasters do not treat casually. The storms that moved through in the pre-dawn hours did not drain the atmosphere, and by morning it reloaded quickly, like the air was only warming up. The warnings did not come out of nowhere. In the days after, a National Weather Service official, Jack Hayes, explained on PBS that conditions had been detectable well ahead of time, models projecting a dangerous pattern into the future, and that communities were warned days before of a threatening tornadic situation. It mattered because it meant the danger wasn't a surprise, but the scale of what arrived still felt like it. By early afternoon, the sky over northeast Mississippi carried that familiar contradiction. Warm air at ground level, a feeling of energy building, clouds thickening and reorganizing, the sense that the day is leaning towards a decision it can't take back. William said that he stepped outside after hearing an alert. It was partly cloudy and warm. Then the air turned cool so quickly he thought the threat had passed, like the storm had blown its anger somewhere else. He went back inside and watched the television. He remembered the meteorologist's voice naming his town on air.
This is significant, and this is heading towards Smithville. You are the next community to be impacted. You need to be in your tornado safe place.
This kind of moment pulls the stomach tight, because it's one thing to hear a warning and another to hear a person say plainly, "It's coming to you." William said that he stood there thinking it wouldn't happen, that it wouldn't be real for him. He didn't have time to be right or wrong for long. He said about 30 seconds later, the power went out. There's also the story of one family. Two sisters were home alone, Audrey, 16, and Cassidy, 11. Their parents were at work, and the sisters had a plan already practiced, already drilled into them by earlier storms. As the day developed, the threat became more certain. The town's K-12 school complex released students early, around 2 in the afternoon, and the whole place shifted into that restless waiting that comes when children arrive home at the wrong time of day and adults pretend not to look as worried as they are. The parents of those two girls followed warnings, looked at radar images, and understood their town sat in the path of something that might not miss. They called their daughters and told them to use the plan. In Smithville, the tornado would be rated EF5 by the National Weather Service. That rating is not assigned because a funnel looks monstrous, or because people call it the worst thing they've seen. It's assigned because of what it does to what it hits. Because survey teams can walk through the path afterward and see damage that requires extreme wind to explain. survey results for the Mississippi segment described a violent tornado at Smithville at 3:44 p.m. CDT, with an estimated peak wind of 205 miles per hour, a maximum width ultimately matched to the connected track at 3/4 of a mile, and a path length for the Mississippi to near Scottsville section listed as 35.1 miles, continuing into Alabama. The timeline sounds clean on paper, down to the minute, but inside the moment, it was not clean. The storm began just southwest of town at about 3:42 p.m, and radar imagery captured the circulation tightening and moving toward a place full of people with errands unfinished and doors unlocked and children home early. In the Heron house, Audrey and Cassidy did what they'd been told to do, followed the plan to the letter. They went to an inside hallway. They covered themselves with blankets. They got down on the floor. It wasn't dramatic. It was methodic. The point of an interior hallway is distance from windows and exterior walls, a thin advantage when the air outside starts throwing boards and glass at lethal speed. The point of blankets isn't comfort. It's to keep shards and splinters from becoming knives. They waited in emergency mode while the rest of their home became something they could not control. Outside, the storm's signature showed itself on radar in a way meteorologists dread seeing over a populated place. A rotating thunderstorm can develop a hook-shaped echo, a curved appendage on radar that often marks where rain and hail are wrapping around a violent circulation. As the circulation tears into structures, it throws debris into the air, and radar can pick up that lofted debris as a debris ball, an area of strong return that isn't rain at all, but pieces of a town. On the ground, the tornado behaved like something beyond the scale people carry in their imagination. The survey described that most trees in the extreme path were snapped or twisted and debarked, meaning the bark was stripped away, a sign of violent wind-driven abrasion. It noted that most of the homes destroyed were well built, 2 stories, less than 10 years old, bolted down to their foundations. That detail matters because it eliminates the comforting explanation that what happened was only because something was weak or old or poorly attached. These were modern houses anchored to concrete, and they still lost. The survey captured the kind of detail that feels unreal until you remember that a tornado is not only wind, it is wind carrying objects, and objects become the storm's teeth. It stated that a 1965 Chevy pickup truck parked in front of one of the destroyed homes had not been found. Not moved, not mangled and located later, not found. It also stated that appliances and plumbing fixtures in the most extreme damage path were shredded or missing. That means that the storm's violence didn't stop at tearing roofs and walls, it reached inside and erased what normally remains after a house is opened up. People who survive a tornado sometimes describe it as a freight train because it gives the brain a shape to hold on to. But even that comparison can feel too small when a storm is stripping bark and making vehicles vanish. In one Reuters report from the days after, a resident named Todd Cleary said that after the storm, there's nothing familiar to see, and that some of his favourite shops were gone. In that sentence, you can hear how disaster isn't only the dramatic loss of a roof, it's the loss of normal reference points, the places your life used to orbit. The official survey for the Mississippi portion listed in clinical bullet points the toll that sits behind those personal words. It recorded 15 fatalities and 40 injuries in the Monroe and Itawamba County segment. It listed destroyed homes and major damage and minor damage. And it included the destruction of the water system, which means that even survivors who still had a standing wall could not rely on the most basic necessity, flowing through pipes. The tornado did not stop at the edge of town. The National Weather Service connected the Smithville damage segment with the Scottsville, Alabama segment, using further examination of satellite imagery that showed tree scars and knocked down vegetation, combined with ground survey evidence. This detail is easy to skip, but it reveals something grim. Even after the funnel leaves the community, the storm's fingerprints can stretch on for miles, visible from above, like a wound across the landscape. Back in the Heron's family story, the tornado did what tornadoes do to families, even when everyone survives. When their parents reached the area about an hour after the strike, they didn't find their daughters waiting at what used to be home. The girls had been told to move away because of possible gas leaks. The parents connected with them later. The girls were virtually unscathed. The house around them had disintegrated. In the hours after, survival became a chain of small decisions. Where do you go when your street is a field of boards? Who do you call when the power is out and towers are down and a phone is suddenly just a cold rectangle in your hand? How do you walk across a ground full of nails without looking down long enough to miss the person shouting for help? How do you keep children calm when even adults don't know where the safe places are anymore?
This is all right off Highway 25. The City Hall, Fire Department, Police Department, Post Office, all destroyed, and the neighborhoods that sat behind them also completely destroyed. Folks picking up and salvaging whatever they could this afternoon.
The scale of the outbreak across the South made everything harder. On PBS, the report that included Smithville described how nearly 1 million people across Alabama were coping with loss of power, water, and communications, and how fuel became a mission because power outages forced gas stations to close. Help moved in from far away, with volunteers loading tractor-trailers of water and convoys of power trucks departing from other states. That broader chaos matters because it means Smithville wasn't only rebuilding itself, it was competing for attention, supplies, and time in a region full of simultaneous emergencies. When Mississippi Governor Haley Barbour toured the damage, he spoke about what the town needed first. Not speeches, not ceremonies, but the capacity to unravel all of this debris to make sure no more citizens were lost inside it. He also said the town was ready to start cleaning up and rebuilding. Chomping at the bit, a phrase that sounds almost too energetic for the scene it described, but maybe that's what people say when standing still would mean staring too long at what's missing. Even the institutions that make up ordinary life were reduced to fragments. The United States Postal Service released a statement the next day saying the Smithville post office had been completely destroyed, leaving all but one wall down, and that postal inspectors arrived quickly to secure the area and recover what mail and accountable items they could.
That was City Hall. It's obliterated. Everybody got out okay. If you look over my other shoulder here, look in the distance of where you see that John Deere backhoe, that was the police department. It's completely destroyed. In fact, there are a number of squad cars that are sitting inside the building. And then when you continue to talk about the heart of government, well, there's nothing more American than the post office, because that's what gives your town the zip code. This was the post office here in Smithville, and it is in complete ruins. By the way, you can pick up your mail at the nearby town that's Amory.
Postal employees shifted operations to Amory. The statement included the old address, Highway 25 North, because even in a town torn open, mail still has to be routed, checks still have to reach people, and the bureaucracy of life keeps trying to function through ruin. Highway 25 was more than an address line. It was the spine of the place, the corridor that held downtown together. The Mississippi State University Fred Carl Jr. Small Town Center later described the tornado as destroying the entire downtown area along Highway 25. And it noted that the center worked as part of the FEMA long-term recovery team to begin rebuilding. That partnership matters because it shows how recovery isn't only neighbors helping neighbors, it's planning, design, grants, meetings, and the slow work of deciding what a town becomes after it's been erased once. In the first hours after the tornado, no one had the luxury of long-term planning. People were still trying to find people. William, who was lost after the house explosion, he woke up an hour and a half later in that field, a quarter mile away from his house, with cuts and a deep cut to his head, covered in blood, dirt, and grass. He said he was taken to Tupelo and spent 2 weeks recovering. It is hard to hold these sentences without imagining the minutes between, the possibility that he wasn't the only person thrown into an open place, the possibility that others did not wake up. The tornado's violence showed itself not just in the debris, but in the way it forced choices on everyone left behind. When whole neighborhoods become unstable piles, rescuers can't move fast enough. When water systems are destroyed, basic hygiene becomes a problem before grief has even had time to settle. When you can't rely on familiar buildings, you can't rely on familiar meeting places, and families who would normally reunite at a church or a local store suddenly have to improvise. In the Reuters coverage, there is a sense of a place trying to speak through shock. The report quotes people describing the sound and the suddenness, the impossibility of believing what happened to a town in minutes. It also carries the weight of officials trying to describe the scene in language that makes outsiders understand why cleanup isn't immediate. Senator Billy Hughes, in that same reporting, said it was as bad as he had ever seen. A plain statement that still feels like an understatement when the survey includes missing vehicles and shredded fixtures. The mechanics of how the storm did it can be explained, but explanation doesn't soften it. Tornado wind is not like straight line wind. In a straight line storm, the force pushes generally in one direction. In a tornado, air rotates around a centre, and as it moves forward, it can slam one side of a structure while lifting the other, changing direction rapidly, turning boards into projectiles, and making roofs fail in ways that open up the entire house. When debris gets caught in that rotation, it becomes a grinding belt that can strip bark and sandblast surfaces, which is why debarking shows up in violent tornadoes. People inside the path rarely experience that physics as rotation. They experience it as an assault from everywhere. The sound changing pitch, the pressure changing the way ears feel, walls breathing in and out, and then the sudden quiet that arrives too fast, leaving the mind trying to fill the silence with meaning. The sisters' survival in the hallway is a representation of that truth. An interior hallway is not a safe room. It's not a near absolute protection. But it is a choice that increases odds when a tornado is not directly lifting the structure off its base. The girls did not need to understand wind speeds to follow the plan. They needed to know where to go, what to cover with, and how to get low. They did that, and they came out. Their parents' experience after the storm shows another pattern common in disasters. The moment when you learn survival doesn't always bring immediate relief. When Jim and Carol Heron arrived, their daughters were not there, and they had to live for a stretch of time in that space of uncertainty, a space where you know your home is gone, and you don't yet know whether the people you love are alive. They eventually found them, and the story becomes one of survival, but it passes through that darker corridor first. The town itself had its own corridor of uncertainty. The governor talked about unravelling debris to make sure no one else was lost inside it. After violent tornadoes, debris piles can hide people and can also hide hazards. Gas leaks and downed lines and unstable walls turn cleanup into a careful search. The act of moving boards becomes an act of checking for bodies, and that reality is one of the reasons communities don't bounce back quickly from storms of this scale. The National Weather Service survey included another set of details that quietly reshape what you think you know about tornado risk. It said the destroyed homes were well built and bolted down, and many were less than 10 years old. That means the storm's core did not choose only the fragile, it chose the new and the sturdy, and treated them the same. For the people left behind, this becomes a psychological injury as much as a physical one. If strong houses can be swept clean, what is safe supposed to mean? In the days after, recovery became a patchwork of immediate needs and long-term choices. USPS had to reroute mail and secure what could be recovered. That seems small compared to deaths and injuries until you remember that mail carries medicine, paychecks, benefits, legal documents, and reminders that a person still exists in the system even after their home is gone. Postal inspectors arrived quickly to secure the site, and employees moved operations to a neighbouring post office. It was the federal version of what families were doing, shifting what they could into any functioning structure nearby.
This is all right off Highway 25. The City Hall, Fire Department, Police Department, Post Office, all destroyed, and the neighborhoods that sat behind them also completely destroyed. Folks picking up and salvaging whatever they could this afternoon.
Across the region, power restoration crews travelled from other states, and volunteers loaded trailers with water and supplies. In the PBS report, the movement of help is described almost like a mobilisation. Convoys leaving from Florida and even Kansas. For towns like Smithville, this meant relief came not as a single wave, but as a series of arrivals, each one bringing something necessary, each one also reminding residents how far the disaster's shockwave travelled. The tornado also became a lesson with names attached to it, because personal stories are how communities teach future versions of themselves. The Heron family story turned into a case study about emergency planning and safe rooms. And the detail that matters most is not the age of the girls or the fact that they were home alone. It is that the family had practiced a plan, had used it during earlier thunderstorms, and had the presence of mind to execute it again when the threat became real. The case study notes that they planned to build a safe room in a new home and to comply with FEMA design guidance, because survival changes what people are willing to invest in. William's account became part of the National Weather Service Tornado Survivor Stories, a first-hand voice preserved on an official site. He wrote about watching the news and thinking it wouldn't happen, about the power outage, the shaking, the pressure drop, the explosion, and waking in a field. When a survivor describes waking up a quarter-mile away, that sentence becomes a warning in itself. More effective than any chart, because it proves that being inside is not always being anchored. Meanwhile, the town faced questions that do not have fast answers. What happens to a missing truck when it is pulled into a violent circulation and never found? How do you grieve for neighbours while also arguing with insurance adjusters and waiting for utility crews and trying to secure a temporary place to sleep? How do you rebuild a downtown along Highway 25 when downtown is now just a concept, not a set of buildings? Long-term recovery is often described in budgets and plans, but the planning itself is a kind of emotional labour. The Mississippi State University Small Town Centre wrote that architecture students partnered to replan the town and design a new municipal centre, including the town hall, police station, fire station and library. That list reads like civic anatomy. Those are the organs that let a town function, the places that make community feel real. Designing them after they've been erased means deciding what normal will look like when the old normal is gone. The National Weather Service survey had already documented that the police station was among the destroyed structures in the Mississippi segment, which makes the idea of building a new municipal centre feel less like an upgrade and more like replacing a missing limb. It also shows how the tornado wasn't only a residential disaster, it struck the town's ability to respond to itself. This is where the story's tension changes shape. In the hours before the tornado, the tension is in the sky and the sirens and the early school release. In the minutes during the strike, it is in the shaking walls and the blankets and the pressure drop. Afterward, tension becomes the slower kind, the kind that lasts weeks and years, built from paperwork and grief and construction and the question of whether people will stay. In the Heron story, the family ended up living in a rented home outside the tornado's path of destruction while planning the next steps. That detail is subtle but important. Even after surviving, the family's life became displaced. Not because of evacuation orders or war, but because a storm erased the physical object that held their history. They saved some clothing, they could not salvage furnishings. And yet, the story emphasises what mattered most: their daughters survived. The PBS reports line about Smithville being chomping at the bit to clean up and rebuild is the emotional counterweight. It's the refusal to let the storm define the town forever. But even that determination lives alongside the reality the governor stated that the first task was unravelling debris to ensure no more citizens were lost in it. That is a town trying to move forward while still searching its own wreckage for the last pieces of the past. The disaster also carried historical weight in Mississippi. PBS noted the National Weather Service described the Smithville tornado's power as the most powerful to hit the state since 1966. The National Weather Service Jackson event summary likewise framed it as Mississippi's first EF5 since 1966. That's not just trivia, it means an entire generation in the state had lived without seeing this specific level of tornado damage in their own borders, which affects public memory and preparedness. A hazard that hasn't struck at the top end in decades can start to feel theoretical, until it isn't. The warning system did what it could, but systems are always filtered through human behaviour. Jack Hayes described how forecasts had identified the conditions days before, yet even with lead time, people still make decisions based on what they've personally lived through. For someone who has heard sirens before and watched storms miss before, the mind tries to file the danger into familiar categories. William wrote that he felt the air turn cool and believed it was over. That's not stupidity, that's pattern recognition, failing under rare circumstances. The tornado punished that failure without mercy. The survey's description of debarked trees and missing appliances makes it clear the storm didn't simply damage a town. It erased the interior of homes. It removed objects people use every day without thinking. Sinks and pipes and fixtures, things normally protected by walls. It also destroyed the water system, which means that even the act of washing blood out of a cut or flushing a toilet became a problem layered on top of a trauma. And still, people survived. 2 girls in a hallway. A man who woke in a field. Residents who stood in the open air afterward and tried to understand what they were looking at. People who drove out of town searching for fuel. People who waited for convoys of trucks from other states. Postal employees who showed up the next day and tried to recover mail from what was left of a federal building. Architects and students who later drew plans for a new civic heart. The tornado's path continued into Alabama, and other communities would carry their own grief and rebuilding stories. But in Smithville, the storm left a specific kind of scar, the one you see when a small place is hit by a force normally reserved for the history books. In the end, the simplest lessons are the hardest ones to live with. A plan matters, warnings matter, and humility matters. Smithville rebuilt because people decided it would, not because rebuilding was easy, and not because the storm left room for comfort, but because the alternative was to let the debris field become the final version of the town. The postal routes shifted and then resumed in a different building. The municipal centre became a design project and then a goal. Families moved into rentals and planned new homes with safer spaces inside them. People told stories out loud to reporters and to officials and to anyone who would listen, because telling the story is one of the ways a community teaches itself how to survive the next time the siren sounds more than once in a morning and the sky feels like it's making up its mind.